brother in broadcasting. He's spoken to Greg Allman, Elton John, Grace Slick, Jerry Garcia, Rick Nielsen, Mel Brooks, the late great Clarence Clemens, John Fogerty. And on September 28, 1974, he spent the afternoon with John Lennon in a studio in New York City on the radio. Very, very jealous of that. Let's just be honest here. Dennis Elsas on the phone with me right now. Dennis, how are you doing? Are you doing fine?
Great. Thanks for reaching out. How you doing?
I'm doing just fine and dandy. You know, about a month or two ago, I was watching, it was PBS, and they had a special on, and it was Lennon NYC, and it was a really cool documentary on John Lennon's time in New York City, which he lived there for basically the last 9-10 years of his life. And you know, you really have one of the most unique stories, I think, ever in broadcasting. And I'll preface it by comparing it to the guy who played drums for Keith Moon when he passed out backstage at the Cow Palace in San Francisco, where the guy got up and finished the Who's set by playing drums. I thought that's got to be the greatest concert experience story ever. And Dennis, can you tell us a little bit about what happened with you on September 28, 1974?
Yeah, you know, it was then, and it still remains, even as I think about it, a magical time. A friend of mine, I was working at WNEW-FM in those days. I was both on the air and music director. And a friend of mine in September had said to me, hey, you know, I think if you could get down to the record plant tonight, I could sneak you in to a recording session where John Lennon is putting the finishing touches on Walls and Bridges. And I said, oh, really? Okay. You know, what time, where, how, who, what, and when? So I got to see the session, and I sort of, you know, got to see John through the glass and just briefly get to say hi. But I was able to chat with May Pang. May Pang is the lady that he lived with and was his girlfriend during the period he wasn't with Yoko. Some refer to that as the lost weekend, although I think aside from screwing things up a little bit in L.A., John did some great work during that period. I chatted with May, and she knew my work from NEW, and I just figured, you know, I got nothing to lose. You know, hey, if John wants to come down to the station to play the new album, and she said, oh, okay, you know, and then I just anyway, the phone rings in at the radio station in the music director's office, my office, you know, a few days later, and it's May Pang. May, how you doing? Good. Yeah, John would enjoy coming, and he'd even like to bring some of his own records too. And I said, oh, well. She said, when would you like him? So, of course, I quickly thinking, I'm on the air Saturday. I said, how's Saturday? She said, that's good. So Saturday, the 28th of September, 1974, it's a rainy Saturday in New York City, and I didn't believe that he would actually show up, so I didn't want to look like a total fool.
Right.
But I kept telling the audience, I've got a big surprise for you. I've got a surprise. Yes, you know, you got to trust me. Tune in, you know, stay, you know, around 4 o'clock today. And John showed up in a taxi, and there he was, John and May and his friend Richard. And as we're doing the interview, and the first 25 minutes of the interview are very much all about Walls and Bridges. He discusses the album. We talk about the significance of number 9, because there's drawings on the cover. And while we're playing one of the songs from the album, we had a huge record wall right behind us in the studio. I mean, the library was immense, and it was literally, there was a full library right behind us. And I don't know, I started talking about the Yesterday and Today album, the famous Butcher cover album.
Yes.
I'm sure some of your audience is familiar with. And I realized, and he was comfortable talking to me, and it's off the air. I said, you know, could we talk about that? Oh, sure, we can. And so, you know, that started a series of Beatle questions, and he was a Beatle fan. I mean, that sounds funny, but, you know, there had been that whole period of I don't believe in Beatles and all of his fights with Paul and whatever else we assumed. But that day in 1974, he was warm, he was engaging, he was friendly, he was right on his game. And then he's brought all these 45s, and he's playing, you know, Richie Barrett, some other guy, some obscure 45s. So this is where I took the intro to Instant Karma from.
What I've heard, when I've heard him talk about music, he always compares it to something else, doesn't he? Does he ever say, oh, that's actually a riff that Bo Diddley did back in 1952 or something?
Yeah, I mean, I was amazed. I wasn't amazed that he was a music historian, but I was amazed at how free he was talking about both the songs that had influenced him and then just commenting on some of the stuff that was out at the time. And so as the interview unfolds, we're talking about that. Of course, I have to bring up immigration because he's in the midst of the big fight for the green card. We don't even know years later how big a fight that was, how close he was to getting thrown out of the country. And we talk about his experiences with having worked with Harry Nilsson, and he admits that he was a little bit of a goofball over the summer. And then I just had to ask him that question that was on everybody's mind, for your listeners that are old enough to realize that until John's death, we all believed that we just kept wondering when, in fact, if the Beatles could ever get together again.
Yeah.
I mean, that really was a real thought. And interestingly enough, all these years later, when you think about every other group that has either stayed together or reunited, but let's not even go there. But he was gracious and open in answering the question, would we ever get together again? And he just, jokingly said, well, maybe when the contract improves and the royalty rate. And he said, we've gotten together, and there's nothing that drives us apart. And he described working on Ringo's record and meeting with Paul. And so he sounded open to the idea. And again, he was receptive to talking about anything and everything.
We're talking to Dennis Elsas from WFUV in New York City, and back in September 74 spent an afternoon with John Lennon. Dennis was kind enough to spend some time with us here. Dennis, you got to spend all that time. He was a very public guy, but did John have any subjects off limits with him?
Again, I think I knew he was there, as I said before, to promote Walls and Bridges, so I wanted to make sure that I gave him the promotional opportunity. The discussion, which appears in Lennon NYC, and they did such a beautiful job of excerpting the interview, he's very frank about immigration. He's very frank about living in New York. He talks about, not being afraid. I mean, of course, it's painfully sad to listen to it all these years later, but he talks about loving New York and loving just walking through the streets and having a cab driver say, hey, how you doing? You still here? And he's just warm and witty, and I couldn't have asked for anything more.
Did you keep in contact with him ever after the interview and stuff? Did you ever, on the Christmas card list?
I had 2 or 3 opportunities to see him again. He came back up to the radio station, and so I got to speak to him again informally, 1 or 2 more times. And the Grammy Awards in those years were a bit of a smaller affair, and I was invited to go to the Grammy dinner, which preceded the theater production of the show. Again, much smaller. It was in a Broadway theater. I'm walking around, and I see that there's the Capitol Records label table, and so I walk over, and John and Yoko are sitting there. He's back with Yoko by now, and I just go over, and I think, all right. I say, hey, John, we met Dennis, Yoko, you know Dennis Elsas. And I was like, wow. It was just... So that was my memory, and a Christmas card that came to the radio station with regards. So
God, that's I just got to say, I'm just green with envy on that stuff. That is just got to be. I would introduce myself hi, how are you? I once talked to John Lennon, and he recognized me somewhere. How are you? That's the way I would always begin every sentence I ever started, I think.
Yeah.
That is really cool. You were talking about memories and how music brings it back and stuff. I was at your website. That's DennisElsas.com, Dennis, ELSAS.com. And you've got some wonderful pictures of all the various people you've talked to. And I was looking at the still shot of you and Bev Bevan, who was the drummer for ELO. And I was looking on the turntable, and it brought back an instant memory, and it was the record label. I forget what label ELO was on, but it was the ELO logo spun, and I forget which album that was, if it was Face the Music or Out of the Blue or what.
It was Out of the Blue.
Was it? Okay. And it like you said, the music, the record labels, all that stuff, the hairdos. You look at the pictures on your website, and there's just some wonderful stuff on there. And you've got great excerpts from all of these people. Dennis Elsas, I really can't thank you enough. I know I kind of bothered you. The truth be told to the listeners, I kind of saw that documentary, that Lennon one, and I'm such a fan of the man that I reached out to you a little bit, and you were kind enough and gracious enough to offer up some of your time. So thank you so much, Dennis. You can find his website at DennisElsas.com. That's Dennis, ELSAS.com. All right, Dennis, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.